For coming. I hope you're all doing okay right now in these crazy times with the pandemic. But we thought we'd try something new, which is, I think everyone's getting tired of just nonstop Zoom meetings and Zoom lectures and so of science. And we thought we might try something by talking science, but also talking about the stories behind the science and the lives of scientists, what gets them excited, what gets them frustrated, the ups and downs. So it's just the human side of science. And so this is sort of an experiment. We've called it the Earthbird seminar series because it's going to be about the Earth. We were thinking that it'd be you're wandering the Earth, seeing all parts of the Earth, and I thought a bird would be good because they go all over the place. And in honor of our first one, Melanie Barboni, who was the hummingbird whisperer, I decided to call it Earthbird. So Emily's the second one, actually, before I start, it would be good to everyone mute themselves, and those on the attendee list, you can ask questions through the chat button if you want, and then we will read them out near the end. Okay, so anyway, so we're at Rice University. Well, I guess we're all over the place right now, it doesn't matter. But I'm at Rice. My name is Cin-Ty, and with a group of students, we're going to start this little experiment, and Emily's one of our first guinea pigs here. So Emily, I'll introduce her. She is currently an assistant professor at Scripps Oceanographic Institute at University of California, San Diego. She got started at Tulane University as an undergrad. And I think that's where she found her love for geology and xenoliths. And then she actually came to Rice University, where she got her PhD, and I forgot when that was, but
2013 or end of 2013.
2013, and she got a number of awards, but one of the neat awards was the Martha Lou Broussard Fellowship. And Martha Lou Broussard, who's actually here in the left corner or left side of the panel here, she was the first woman to graduate in geology in our department long ago, and she's still, well, that was probably the wrong choice of words, but she's here with us, and she has all the history of Rice and does a lot to really take care of our alums, take care of the department, and take care of our current students with her fellowship, which is to support women in the earth sciences and their professional development. So it's really good to have. Are you guys hearing an echo here? Okay, it's gone now. Good. Okay, so, oh yeah, and then after Rice, she went to Brown University, and then a couple years there, and then went to UC San Diego. So welcome, Emily. And I thought I'd start off with asking you, I guess I never asked you about this. How did you get into geology?
I think you did when I visited Rice a long time ago, but
okay.
Yeah, really it was when I was an undergrad. I took mineralogy, and it was a pretty traditional optical mineralogy class, and that was really the key, I think, because I remember the first time I looked at a mantle peridotite, and I know Cindy's been posting some really cool examples. I have one here.
Yeah, why don't you show everyone?
Yeah. So this is actually similar to probably the same place. It's really crumbly, so I have to hold a bandana over it. But yeah, this is a peridotite xenolith from San Carlos. And when I first saw one of these in mineralogy class, I thought it was like one of the most beautiful rocks, because it's not very often you see a green rock like this. And I'm from the East Coast where there's no nice outcrops of geology and definitely not any fresh xenoliths. So and then it got even more amazing when, you know, we looked at them under the microscope and I realized, wow, like there's a whole hidden view of minerals, and that really just got my curiosity like peaked, and I got really into geology and decided to major in it. And that's kind of, you know, I think it really just started from that mineralogy class and looking at rocks and having the time to really explore them and, you know, learn about them in the sort of traditional way, which involved a lot of the optical.
Was there someone at Tulane that really kind of inspired you?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, it was Steve Nelson, who actually he was a student of Ian Carmichael's, one of his early PhD students, and he worked on Mexican volcanism and a lot of, you know, sort of the petrology and geochemistry of Mexican volcanic rocks. And he taught our mineralogy class and petrology class, and really his dedication to teaching was I think really what inspired the students so much. Like he was so passionate about it, and he'd been teaching it for such a long time that it was just like when you see someone like that who's had so much experience and knowledge, it's really cool as a student who knows nothing to kind of soak it in.
He was infectious in a good way, geology. Good. So I guess you still, well, you started working on xenoliths, and you're still working on xenoliths in San Diego. And I think what we're gonna migrate to our little presentation of her work. She's going to talk, for those who are just chiming in, this is Emily Chin from UC San Diego, and she's going to talk about looking at the upper mantle and how it behaves through xenoliths, which are fragments of rocks brought up from the mantle to the surface in volcanoes. So and then after that, she's going to show some of her art. So please stay tuned for that too, which is just fascinating stuff that she does. Before we get to your presentation, do you want to just summarize in kind of words a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yeah, so I'm doing, as Cynthia, as you said, I'm still fascinated by xenoliths and the deep crust and the upper mantle. So it's kind of, you know, funny thinking when I was an undergrad in 2008, you know, over 12 years later, I'm still looking at the same rocks in a way and finding that I know like even less. But I guess that's how science works, right? But yeah, the stuff I'm going to talk about today for the science part is some really exciting work that a former postdoc at Rice, Rachel Bernard, who's now a professor at Amherst College. She was a postdoc between 2018 and 2019, and she and I were both really interested in kind of understanding deformation in the deep crust, particularly beneath large strike-slip faults, which me now being in San Diego, that's a thing that we, you know, constantly think about, these large faults like the San Andreas and earthquake. There was just a big earthquake swarm yesterday in the Salton Sea. So we've been kind of trying to attack this problem by thinking about how deep do these faults go, and how can we, you know, use xenoliths because they sample that deep crust. And there's actually xenoliths that have erupted through the fault zone. They're not very common, but they can tell us something about the sort of present state deformation and whether, you know, what's causing that. Is it, you know, when you think of faults, there's a lot of things at depth that might be promoting, you know, the deformation, like fluid flow, heat, melt. So we wanted to kind of attack this problem, and we went down to Baja, California, which, you know, I'll show a map of it, but that's actually still part of our, you know, moving plate boundary. And there's a lot of little cinder cones, little basaltic volcanoes that actually erupted through that plate boundary that we found xenoliths in. So I'll be sharing some work that Rachel and I are writing up now, and you know, we're really excited about it.
Do you want to start showing your slides?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
And we'll probably, I'm trying to get Rachel on here at some point too. So.
Yeah. Cool. So everyone can see this?
Yes.
For some reason I can't control my mouse. Oops. Well, all right. Maybe I can. Yeah, so this is, so there's a photo of Rachel. Yeah, the kind of title here is what goes on beneath plate boundaries, and using xenoliths as a probe for that, because there was a attempt to drill down into like the San Andreas, but we can't really ever get deeper than 5-6 kilometers. And so processes that are much deeper than that along the plate boundary, we need to have these xenolith fragments, as I'll explain what they are in a bit, to help us understand what's going on. So here's the kind of geologic setting of Baja California. And I'm sure many of you have seen these cartoon animations that are really great by Tanya Atwater. I'm just playing it here. This is kind of the evolution of North America from 40 million years ago till present. And just direct your eyes to the bottom right, where you can see how Baja California has rifted away from the mainland continent and then developed this motion that kind of coupled with the Pacific plate now as a transform boundary. And so, the most famous strike slip fault in the world is probably San Andreas, but that, this whole sort of margin of the Western US, at least California down to Baja, it's all related kind of in this, oops, play this again, in this evolution since 40 MA or so. And really our interest was, when we think of faults, we really think of, that they happen in the brittle regime, right? It's upper crustal, but there's actually, if you can see this cartoon on the lower right, there's actually a lot of increasing recognition that faults can actually penetrate deep into the crust, maybe even into the mantle, and seismic data are showing us this. So the kind of big question is, how deep do these big strike slip faults go, and can we see what kind of processes are going on at depth? So to do that, we look at xenoliths, which is a cartoon is shown here of how a xenolith erupts, and this is in a kimberlite. So these are not the same types of lavas that erupted the samples I'm going to talk about, but this is just from Wikipedia. So xenoliths are just fragments. They mean foreign rock, fragments of rock, deep rock that are brought up in very rapid volcanic eruptions. So in this case, a kimberlite can erupt in a matter of hours. And so it, as it's erupting and degassing, it rips up all these fragments of the mantle along the way. And those are direct pieces of the mantle. And so on the right here, this is an entire thin section scan of actually a peridotite xenolith we collected in Baja, California. And you can see, so here I took the thin section and I scanned it in cross-polarized light, so you can see all the colors representing the different birefringence, different, basically, anisotropy of those minerals. But what's really cool about this sample is this really deformed texture. So you can see in the middle, there's this very wavy gray mineral. That's actually an orthopyroxene, a mineral. And that wavy texture is actually evidence that it's just been deformed and strained to a high degree. And San Quintin, which is the area we went down to in Baja California, I'll show you in the next slide, is actually quite famous for these very deformed peridotite xenoliths. And the idea is that they might be representing recent deformation with this strike slip fault at depth. So Rachel and I, here's a photo of Rachel and another technician who worked in our lab for a year before he moved on to ETH for his PhD, Lonnie. We drove down to Baja, California, and it's actually really close to San Diego. We rented a car, drove 5 hours down, and we stayed in this little cabin by the beach, which was great. And we had good several days of looking at these cinder cones. So there's an example shown here on the left. This is a cinder cone that erupts, and we sort of sampled many of these to look for crustal and mantle xenoliths, and we came back with something like probably 4 dozen or so xenoliths, and we got a lot of material to work with. So here I'm going to kind of dive more into the science now, and really, even though Cin-Ty mentioned mantle xenoliths, and that's something I'm actively working on, one of the kind of goals of this project in particular was the deep crust. And the reason for that is you can see in this block diagram, this block diagram is showing a sort of cartoon model of a strike slip fault. And the moho, so there's like the light blue crust and then the greenish mantle. And the kind of sort of model or hypothesis is how do these crustal faults go through the moho or behave near the moho? Because we think of the crust and the mantle, right, as kind of two compositionally different rock types, rheologically different. And so do they persist through the moho? Do the faults go all the way through the moho? Do they maybe change orientation or stop because the moho is just, or the underlying mantle is a boundary? And so we were really just interested in finding the deepest crustal samples that we could get our hands on that could sample that kind of transition. And so San Quintin, which is shown in this map on the right, is a recent volcano that erupted like 10,000 years ago or something. So it brought up very recent bits of the mantle and the crust. And we found two groups of xenoliths, lower crustal xenoliths, which are shown here. These are, again, entire thin section scans. So we have a really cool slide scanner that we scan thin sections so that when we do further analyses, we can really be able to map out and mark where we've done things. And it's also just nice to, especially during COVID, it's been really nice to be able to look at your thin sections without the microscope this way. So
can I pipe in with one thing that Walter Alvarez taught me here at Berkeley, which I'd never seen and was amazing. And perhaps you've done this and it's common, but he had an old slide projector and a little adapter where he puts in a thin section and then projects it. And so you get your thin section to be like as tall as you, and you can like go in it. And anyway,
that's actually really cool. Yeah, I've never heard of that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no, it's like, and it's really for beautiful thin sections like this too. It just makes it be this sort of live, big, vivid experience. So if certainly around Berkeley, there's lots of slide projectors just sort of sitting around in an old closet. So maybe that's the case at Scripps too, and you could give it.
Yeah, I bet there is. Hopefully, no one throws them out. Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, so we focused on the lower crust, and we kind of found out of maybe 24 or so xenoliths, we realized that there were two groups of xenoliths in the lower crust. And the first group, which is what we called, sorry, messed up the labels here, but group 1 is shown, here's a cross-polarized image on the left. And that texture, these are all gabbros, so these are like mafic, basaltic composition samples where you have a lot of pyroxene, plagioclase, and some olivine. And the group 1 xenoliths are very kind of classical cumulates, so you would think about them as just, if you were underplating a melt and just let it cool and crystallize, you would get this sort of texture that indicates this sort of crystallization. And I don't know if you can see it, but that gray mineral in the background, that's actually one very big plagioclase grain that encloses or crystallize around pyroxene grains, which are these smaller, brighter colored minerals. And so we think these are maybe evidence of some kind of basaltic underplating. There's a lot of subduction, post-subduction magmatism and volcanism in this area since 14 million years ago or so. But what was really interesting was there was a second group of xenoliths, which I'm showing here, the group 2 ones. They have this really interesting layered structure, which we thought was quite distinct from the group 1. And so sometimes just kind of, making these observations, that all we did was look at the samples and we already found something distinctive about this one group of samples from one volcano. And so we looked deeper at these group 2 xenoliths, and here's another thin section scan. I try to show off these images because they're just so nice to look at. And on the right is is a map where we actually took this and we used the SCM, which is an electron microscope, and we were able to quantify the phases using a technique called EBSD, which I'll discuss about in a minute. But basically this structure you're seeing, or this texture you're seeing, is an interesting one because around some of these plagioclase and olivine grains in this sample, we have these sort of coronas, not the coronavirus. Coronas meaning, you know, like a ring. And the ring is made up of minerals that we think have a clear relationship to each other, meaning they probably form from some reaction with from a melt or fractional crystallization. So in this case, we're seeing olivine, which is this pale green mineral. Then we have orthopyroxene or enstatite, which is this darker green. And then out on the outer part is this yellow, this wormy stuff, this yellow stuff, which is clinopyroxene. And so it's kind of these concentric rings. And I won't go into details here, but the sort of key takeaway from the first ring, or the first corona, which is this orthopyroxene around olivine, is that that's a kind of textbook sort of sign that you have a melt reacting with olivine. So there's a phase diagram here, but basically if I see this sort of orthopyroxene around olivine, it could mean that there was a melt involved and that this melt was crystallizing or reacting with the olivine to form orthopyroxene. And so that's one hypothesis for how these pyroxene coronas can form. So we were really kind of interested by this because, as I mentioned before, sort of what is driving, you know, what is lubricating deep faults, right? You need some way for like these sort of rocks that are stiff and wouldn't otherwise move around to kind of weaken, right? So that there can be a plate boundary movement. And so maybe melt or fluid is involved there. So yeah, this is kind of a technical slide, but I wanted to try to condense it down to kind of one key takeaway message. What we found was that, I'm simplifying a lot of things here, but basically in some of these gabbros, we did some detailed sort of grain orientation analyses, which is shown in these circle diagrams. And if you just follow the orientation of this green line and its relationship to the dashed line, you can see this green line is actually the trend of those orthopyroxene grains. And these different colors in this map represent different minerals. So just focus on the lime green stuff. That is just orthopyroxene around olivine. And it's hard to tell. It's even really hard to tell in thin sections. But what we found was that if we plotted the actual orientation of the long axis of these orthopyroxene grains with respect to the horizontal foliation, there was a clear shift from the sort of like really nice magmatic layered fabric to these more disrupted, more corona-filled gabbros. And that's shown here in these middle diagrams, which are circles, and they have this number next to them, which indicates that the degree at which that's oriented. So if you just follow this green, for some reason I don't have my laser pointer, but if you just follow this green, light green line, you can see that orthopyroxene is oriented at a really high angle to the foliation, that black line. And then as we get more and more, you know, to this sort of different texture, that angle decreases to about 20 degrees. And that was really kind of interesting because one of my former colleagues, Vincent Sustel, who we were both postdocs at Brown and shared an office together, he had done some experiments where he took things like peridotite, olivine, and then he put melt in it, and then he deformed it at a high pressure, sometime, you know, at like 1 GPa, which is 30 kilometers or so, so something like at the MOHO. And you can see here, I'm just showing it, this is actually the press from Rice. So he did these high pressure experiments where he actually found the same exact thing we saw in the natural samples, that when you form this reaction from the melt, as he increased the shear strain, meaning as he deformed the samples more and more, he saw this exact kind of shift in the orientation of these corona textures. And so that was really cool to us because first it was, you know, we had just made these observations ourselves, and we were thinking, oh, that's really interesting. Well, why would, you know, this sort of, what would be causing this sort of shift in the orientation of these corona textures? And then when we came and looked at the experimental work, we, you know, it was really kind of convincing to us that we think this is actually melt and deformation happening at the same time. And that texture we're seeing is evidence of this kind of melt present deformation. So I know that was probably kind of a lot in this slide, so we can, I'm happy to chat more about it.
So Emily, so what is the melt phase, the purple color in your thin section? Is it plagioclase?
Yeah, that's plagioclase. Yeah, sorry, for some reason the legend got cut off. Sorry, the purple is plage, and the blue is olivine, and then the green is pyroxene.
So this is a mantle vanillite. So theoretically, you do not have kind of absolute reference. So where the deformation is. So you are kind of using the horizontal layer as the kind of the shear direction.
Yeah, that's a great question, Wenron. So right, when you work with xenoliths, you know, they're not from an outcrop, so we don't have any really reference frame for the absolute kinematic reference frame. But we basically take each xenolith and we assess we try to find a marker of strain, like an elongated mineral or a foliation, something like that. And yeah, that's a big question, but really with xenoliths, you really have to kind of, I think, work within the sample you have. And because we know these all came from one spot, one volcano, they all erupted at the same time, we can probably assume they're pretty close in space to each other. And so what we're seeing, you know, who knows, maybe we're completely wrong and it doesn't record this, but you know, we don't have any way to test if there's actually, you know, what an outcrop like this would look like. So yeah, that's definitely an issue when you work with xenoliths, and it can be tough to get around. But there's a lot of, Rachel, for instance, has been doing a lot of really cool stuff with micro CT scanning, where you can actually see into the rock and find other markers of strain when you do this sort of 3D CT scanning. Yeah, so here's kind of our cartoon interpretation, and I'm really sort of simplifying things a lot here just because I wanted to make this talk hopefully understandable, but I know there's a lot of petrology. So I think what we are interpreting is that, you know, these xenoliths are representing pieces of a deep crustal shear zone, and we think that the group one, those really boring, classic looking poikilitic cumulate ones are kind of probably just some sort of underplated basalts that, you know, formed at some other time. You know, there's active volcanism going on in this area. And then the group two could be this, you know, this progression we saw with this corona texture could actually represent pieces of a widening shear zone. And I'm showing this here in this cartoon. So there's these blue lines. So when we think of a kind of fault, you know, in the brittle regime, in the upper crust, it's a very narrow kind of, you know, it's a crack, it's a fracture. But as you go deeper, you get the activation of these abductal deformation mechanisms. And so the deformation is more widely distributed. And so at depth, like in the Moho, we may actually have a very broad zone of deformation. And that could be facilitated if you have melting or heating that allows this sort of broad zone to persist. It can't be too broad or else it won't ever really localize strain, but it's probably wider than we see at the surface. And I think these xenoliths are potentially showing us a snapshot of that. So you might be asking, where did we get all this melt from? And you know, that's kind of a really interesting question. I won't go into it here, but there's been a lot of really interesting and mysterious magmatism that occurred in Baja California since you know, 6 million years ago and earlier. And Baja California itself was actually part of an arc a subduction zone, which is related to the Peninsular Ranges batholith and the Cretaceous batholiths in Western North America. And then, as you saw in that cartoon, that animation, we had the the Farallon plate started to break up around 28 million years ago, and these little microplates subducted, and we got this development of this, this strike-slip boundary with no subduction. But for some reason, we still had magmatism that continued. And you normally think of magmatism as occurring at a at a plate boundary where you have either subduction, or you have either splitting apart of the plates where you can have the mantle upwelling. And that's definitely happening in the Gulf of California, which is related to the East Pacific rise and the seafloor spreading there. But what's quite interesting is that there's a lot of other types of volcanism in Baja that can't really be explained by subduction or by seafloor spreading. And we looked at the trace element compositions of some of the pyroxenes in these xenoliths, and we can actually calculate what the melt or what the magma composition that would have last been in equilibrium with those xenoliths could be like. And we did that, and that's shown in these orange and blue lines here. And for comparison, we compared a bunch of other types of melts. The blue field are these kind of weird melts called atakites. And atakites are a melt with very high strontium or high lanthanum ytterbium, high strontium ytterbium ratio, meaning the elements on the left side of the plot, which are highly incompatible, are much higher in that melt. And the elements on the right, like ytterbium, lutetium, are depleted. And one explanation for that is because there's a mineral garnet, which takes those elements on the right side of the plot. And one of the explanations for atakites is that it could have been a melt of an eclogite slab. So when you have subduction, you have you have the slab that dehydrates and it gets metamorphosed to eclogite facies, where you convert the basalt to garnet and pyroxene. And if you melt that slab, the garnet's going to hold back all that ytterbium and lutetium and other heavy rare earths, and it will release the lighter rare earths to the melt. And so that blue field is showing that these atakites and also these other types of rocks called Bahaites that erupted all along Baja California, those are actually thought to be potentially melt of a slab. Maybe when the Farallon slab was subducting, eventually a slab window opened up, and maybe part of it, as it was opening, parts of that slab, as it was tearing off, could have melted. And so we were comparing our calculated melts to this, and we actually found it didn't really fit. So our blue and orange lines are kind of too shallow for that. And so, we were wondering, oh, what else could be that melt that interacted with those gabbros? And I don't have it plotted on here, but if you were to just melt the asthenosphere, like in a seafloor spreading environment, like in the Gulf of California, you would get a melt that would be very depleted in light rare earth elements, and that's not also what we see. So one idea is that maybe we are melting a slab or a crust, but it's not really deep. It's not like a slab that's at 90, in the garnet facies. And this is not a new idea. There's an idea that from seismology, there's evidence that we might have bits of the Farallon slab that kind of failed to subduct successfully all throughout the Western US. And this is a diagram from a paper in 2013 from a seismic study. And all you need to know is that the blue stuff means high velocity, so you can think of it as dense, cold crust, so you can think of it as a stuck behind plate. And things that are redder, more red, are warm, so they could be like the mantle or a partially molten mantle. And so you can see beneath Baja, there's a big blue thing. And one idea is that maybe because Baja really rifted very, very quickly, and the movement is very fast, right? It's moving northwestward quite rapidly, even now, that maybe it dragged part of that slab, and if there's a little bit of mantle trapped in between, we might get some melting through shear heating. And that's potentially one way that, this whole fault, maybe this wide sheared zone at depth could be promoted by shear heating melting. And it can't be too deep though. So we can't have it coming from like the garnet facies. So maybe it's a slab over at the very top of the slab melting. That might be the cause. Finally, another second idea is that maybe this sort of deformation is actually not from the slab, if there's a fossil slab there, but it could be just two distinct crustal blocks, moving together. And that's shown in this cross section here and this geologic map. So on the map, all the green stuff and pink stuff are old arc crust that was associated with the Cretaceous magmatism. And then all the yellow stuff are oceanic sediments that we think underlying that is just oceanic crust. So we can think maybe when Baja rifted, there was a big fault called the Toscos Abreojos fault that was kind of like a proto mini San Andreas, not really active now, but perhaps at, in recent times, this could have caused, this could have been how that fault was moving at depth and kind of promoting this whole plate boundary movement. So maybe it's two different crustal blocks. So yeah, how does this, I wanted to maybe wrap it up here and so we have time for questions, but how does this all relate back to North America and Baja? So, there's these models, different models. This is really nice work that Rachel did in her PhD work, also a xenolith study where, kind of trying to test some of these ways that large crustal strike slip faults could behave at depth. And, what we're thinking is there's probably some important role for melt involved in here. And, it looks like that I haven't talked about the mantle in this particular talk, but the fact that I showed you that really deformed mantle xenolith, that's quite interesting. So we think maybe this entire mantle and crust are deforming. They could be deforming at different rates because they're just different composition, different water contents, things like that. But what we're proposing is that we have a really important role for melt. That melt could have come from shear heating of different blocks. You don't need a lot of it. If you have a little bit of melt, that could be enough to lubricate the faults, and it may not actually erupt. So it might be trapped down there, and the evidence of that melt is these corona textures that we interpreted to be reactions from a melt. So that's kind of the story. I don't know if this was, we can conclude here and have time for questions. I may have simplified things a lot, or maybe it was too confusing. But if we want to just chat about this.
Yeah, let's have time for some questions. I think it's good to be simple, actually. So don't worry about that. I think one of my mentors had told me never to be embarrassed about being simple. So yeah, just because I know that there are people attending this talk that may not be geologists or just interested in general science. I just want to put it quickly in context that what Emily is working on is a real big problem of how do you actually make plates on the Earth. And on Earth we have plates, which means you have plate boundaries where all the deformation, like the San Andreas Fault or the mid-ocean ridges, are very, very narrow. But if you go on to something like another planet, you don't get these narrow boundaries. And one of the hypotheses that's been put forward is that you have to localize all that deformation. And one possibility is adding melts. And people have suggested that, but finding evidence for that has been somewhat elusive. So I think, Emily, it sounds like you found some evidence for that. Is that right?
Well, that's what we think.
Yeah,
we think those corona textures could be. And I didn't go into. I'm glossing over most of the work Rachel did, which she did a lot of really detailed EBSD work. That the fabrics of these rocks are actually not really strained like the way that you would expect a dry peritite to be deforming. And when you have a lot of melt around, you kind of localize a different type of deformation, and we call this grain size sensitive creep. which usually is promoted when you have reactions or fluids. And so all of Rachel's really nice work kind of really also supports that, but I didn't have time in this talk to go there. So yeah, I think we're seeing evidence that there's some kind of melt phase that's promoting the deformation, and at least for part of these analytes, they might be capturing a bit of that. I see there's a question from Michael. Do you reserve phlogopite, amphibole, or carbonates? No, we actually don't. And that's yeah, it's a good question. We actually don't observe any hydrous phases. And yeah, that was kind of what was, and it's still kind of puzzling to me because, you know, you normally think, oh, melt, there should be lots of water and stuff, but maybe this melt is just kind of, you know, may not be very hydrous. And if we, or it could have been, you know, maybe we do have hydrous crust, but it wasn't sampled in this particular eruption. So the coronars are just like these really, you know, it's just kind of orthopyroxene, then clinopyroxene, and then spinel in there. But if you think about that sequence, you know, you can think of fractionating a Moore melt at depth, and you would kind of get the same sort of fractional crystallization sequence. But yeah, that's a good question. We don't observe a lot of hydrous minerals in these.
It's Michael Laura just had a paper come out on atacites, or you may not call them atacites, Michael, but yeah, I think that's what's motivating part of his question. I put you on as a panelist, Michael, so you should be somewhere.
Yeah, I could talk. I'm just in a really dark place, so I don't think you'd be able to see me if I turned my camera on.
Well, I hope you're not in a dark place right now.
No, literally, it's a literal dark place. It's a room which is dark.
Okay. Well, we have any other questions? You know, put them in the chat if you're shy. I can fill in the time was other questions come in.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, Jackson, is that you, Jackson?
Hey, did you look at any of these rocks for sort of like peroxenite signatures, like elevated zinc-iron ratios, or anything along those lines?
No, not yet. That's something we could. So we just did a bunch of laser ablation work on the pyroxenes mostly, and focusing, you know, mostly on like rare earths and large iron lithophile elements and kind of the easy stuff. So we didn't really do a dedicated transition metal analysis. But yeah, we, you know, just from the rare earth pattern though, I think that tells you, that can kind of tell you a lot about what, and this is, again, this is the melt that's in equilibrium with the CPX. So it's, you know, you can see, well, A, it's not Moore-like, and B, it's not really atacite-like. So it's kind of, you know, I don't know, what would a peroxenite melt look like on here? Maybe flat?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, but maybe a future analysis.
We have a question from Wen Rong. In mafic systems, why does plage represent melt? Sometimes in the field, I see gabbro is usually intruded by coarse grained, plage-rich veins.
Gabbro is intruded by quartz-rich? Sorry.
Coarse grained, big grains of plage.
Oh, why does, yeah, so in these rocks, we actually think that that the plage, so I can go back to even like here, we actually think, so the plage is this clear stuff, and we actually think those are, you know, if you think of a kind of gabbro like in a morb environment, mid-ocean ridge environment, you would have plagioclase and you know, you would have plagioclase as a very early crystallizing cumulate mineral, and so we think that plagioclase is early, and olivine could be early too. And those coronas form on top of it, or as a reaction with plage and olivine. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
Is the plage crystallized early or late? It's kind
We
of
think it crystallized early. because it's not part of it's not, it's kind of these like large coarse-grained.
The reason I'm asking because in the immigrant gap, we have kind of mafic to ultramafic kind of system. It's probably not related to this, but in the field, we always see kind of the peroxenite or sometimes peridotite cutting by those white hydro-rich veins.
Yeah, those could probably be really different from this. That's
Yeah.
probably late stage. Are they very like they're like pegmatites kind of even?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that's what's happening here. Those veins are probably much later and at a kind of colder condition. But yeah, we think these are just kind of like gabbros that had melt react through with them.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry for that.
Let's move on because we're running out of time here.
Yeah, I can go to the next.
You have a quick question from Kent Condi, which you can probably answer quick. Have you found bedelliite in the gabbros?
We haven't looked, but yeah, so no, we haven't. We don't really see much zircon either, but we haven't really looked super hard for accessory minerals.
Okay, let's turn over. So Emily, turns out, is quite the artist, and the art is in her science and in her illustrations as well. And somehow they all come together, I think. You want to show us a little bit about
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, so I guess I was going to share just kind of, on the side, I've always done art ever since I was a kid, actually. Since I was able to hold a pencil, I drew stuff. And it was really kind of a nice thing to have as like a hobby, as a refuge, especially in college. I took a lot of art classes for fun, and they were kind of like what I did in my free time, and it was just a nice kind of escape from from geology. Of course, I love geology, but you can't stuff your brain all day with one thing. So it's nice to have something else to do. And it kind of just got me not thinking in an academic way. Like it was, I think what really kind of drew me to taking these art classes. I took a lot of printmaking classes, and this is one example of a lithograph, which is actually kind of really related to geology. So this photo here, this is actually Tulane print studio, which is one of the best undergrad teaching print studios. So I actually got really lucky too that I was at a university that had really great like art facilities, and I kind of just stumbled into it because I was curious and just took these classes for fun. But what he's doing here is actually printing on a limestone slab, and it's actually the same limestone that Archaeopteryx, the fossil, was found in. The Tulane Art Studio is actually one of like the only ones in North America that has like 30 of these slabs. Like you can't even get them today. So I only bring this up because during grad school I did a lot of isotope geochemistry and geochemistry that involved like acid and kind of all this these very like tough techniques. And when I was doing art, we were doing kind of all of that. We were learning how to like etch a limestone slab and make it be able to print an image like that with nitric acid. It was very dilute, although, it was really funny how in art class you never really care about the safety. So we all kind of had mild acid burns on our fingertips, and our teacher would be like, oh, it's fine, it'll just peel off in a day. And then when we work in science, it's like, oh, we need to like suit up, because it's just a really different, it's probably much better now. They're a lot more aware of that. But, I just really enjoyed using my hands, learning techniques. And I think all of that kind of prepared me to become a scientist and to work in a lab setting and kind of pick up these things as techniques. So I always find time to draw. Even in grad school, I didn't do a lot of drawing because, of course, I was busy doing my PhD and probably went months without drawing anything. But during COVID, it's been kind of nice because I saved about an hour and a half of commuting time, and it's kind of amazing what that frees up. So some of these are older drawings that I did pre-COVID, but a lot of the inspirations I have are nature and kind of like the scientific illustration aspect of nature, and trying to illustrate things accurately. So birds, of course, because Cin-Ty got me into birds, like he gets all of his students into birds. It's like an infectious disease. Plants, and then, also things just like mythology, personal experiences, dreams, these all kind of crystallize into ideas. And this thing on the right is one piece I did recently where it's kind of thinking about, I was reading an article about how insects like moths and fireflies have been declining a lot since, the past 10, 15 years. And it's probably a combination of, climate change and human activity and just humankind's like imprint on nature is really kind of like this nightfall on Earth in a way. It's like we've messed up a lot of things, and insects are fleeing. There's like this huge decline in insects, and this like giant Luna moth, this green moth, is one species that's been declining a lot in North America as well. Actually, I remember seeing one when I was a kid, and it was just, they're like huge, they're like this big. But I try to bring in kind of these concepts of how nature is affecting humans and our experience. And when I can, I'm not like, I never formally took illustration classes, so it's just kind of like a scribble that becomes a drawing. And I think the kind of nice thing about art is like, I've been getting a lot more into colored pencils lately, and this is a very slow medium, unlike painting. Sometimes to do a colored pencil piece can take 10 to 12 hours in total. And it reminds me a lot of like doing research, right? We really do research little by little, a layer or a connection comes to light, and then that's kind of one more layer on top of the drawing. And you're always kind of like zooming into the detail, zooming out to the big picture. And that's kind of how I see doing these illustrations. It's like trying to capture the essence of something without being overly detailed or overly broad. And it's hard. It's just like writing a scientific paper. You want to balance all of those things to make your stuff relevant and exciting to people who aren't artists or scientists. So yeah, those are kind of my few words. Here's some other recent drawings I did, but there's a lot of parallels, I think, with being an artist and being a scientist, and they're kind of, sometimes I think people look at artists as these sort of up in the clouds, like their head is not down to earth, but it's really hard to do like some of these techniques. And when I was taking art classes, I was like, man, I would wake up at 4 a.m. to go to the glass studio to like melt glass for our class at 9 a.m. And there's a lot of like technical hard labor involved in crafting something. Just like how science, a lot of it, 99% of it is in the lab or analyzing your data that no one ever sees, and they just see you present it, or you see a paper. But there's a lot of things that didn't work out along the way, and learning mistakes that happened. So yeah, a little how art and science are connected.
These are beautiful, Emily. Really, thanks for sharing all of this, your talents. And I would just echo that art is actually a little bit like science, and science, I don't think we all realize it, is actually an art. Just like writing is an art, and all art is about observing, and science is about observing too. So we're all actually the same, artists of all types, musicians, writers, scientists, we're the same, I think. So so these are all color pencil?
The one on the left is, and then I'm like a dry media person, unlike you, Cin-Ty. I can't paint. It's just kind of too fast for me. But yeah, the things on the right are all done with like actually just markers and pen. So I love just using dry like by dry medium I mean not paint.
Yeah. No, this is great. The paint, as you say, is much faster, and people know me. I have no patience, so I spend. That's why I paint instead of do this. But yeah, these are really nice. And do you paint or draw from photographs or some field sketches?
Yeah, so I try to really focus on things I've seen, and I use my own photos, and then I use a lot of photos, like the Birds of the World website is really great.
Yeah.
The Macaulay Library has great photos. So it's kind of a combination. I use the bird book to make sure I'm accurate. I use photos, I use my own photos, I use my own memories. It's all kind of a mix of things.
Yeah, what I like is you also insert your own style into it. I can see that.
Yeah, it's a little cartoony, I know.
Yeah, no, it's good. I really like it. It's really creative. I wanted to ask, because we wanted to hear about, of course, your science and
Yeah.
sides of scientists. Maybe because we have students here or people in different stages of their career.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to ask you. You went from undergrad to PhD to postdoc and now assistant professor, and I can't imagine that in every step it's a major transition, right? And
Yeah.
And when you see people that have made it, you think, oh, it must have been easy, but there must have been. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges and how you overcame them, or every story is different. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I went from undergrad straight to professor, and it's kind of weird because I guess I've never left school yet, in a way. But I think each step there was a big transition, and I guess I'll rewind back to when I was an undergrad. Like, I didn't go to a research intensive university where, as an undergrad, I didn't do any research really. I did a little project as a senior, but I had no kind of actual hands-on experience with a lab, or I had never even read a scientific paper as an undergrad. And so what was really just driving me was this curiosity about mantle prototypes, and I really wanted to work with Cin-Ty and work with someone who was an expert on that. It was kind of a huge leap when I think about it, and I kind of just hurtled myself forward without really thinking about how it would work out. And I think one of the things that really kept me going was just I really like looking at rocks, and as Cin-Ty mentioned, like this sort of feedback between science and art, that kind of, I realized science is a lot like art, and it's kind of a way to be an artist. Even if I'm not a professional visual artist, I feel like as a scientist, everything you craft, has to make sense, has to have an impact, and that kind of, I think, was the overarching, reason I really like to pursue science. But then, from PhD to postdoc, in my postdoc, I did something quite different from my PhD. I worked with folks at Brown University, Greg Hurst and Alberto Saul, who are mostly, Greg is a rock deformation person. So I kind of moved into the sort of world of, and a big bird watcher, yeah. Seems like a theme. But yeah, I moved into that realm of like kind of understanding deformation, and that sort of really continued to inspire me even now to kind of try to link petrology and geochemistry with the micro-textural and sort of structural deformation components, that how we can do that with different data sets. And that to me is like, it's kind of like trying out a different medium when you're an artist. Like, how can I make this work? And you don't really know, but you can maybe combine like all different things and it can work somehow. So that's kind of that's what inspired me as a postdoc, and I think as a professor, like it's now trying to like execute that vision of how do I, because I'm really just classically like a geochemist and a petrologist, and ultimately that's really still what I am, but I like to bring in all these different techniques to try to just understand rocks better. And yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, Cin-Ty, but it's kind of like been really random for me.
I also was sort of interested in, if you had, pushing you, that were there any struggles?
Yeah, definitely.
Don't feel comfortable answering that. That's fine.
No, definitely struggles, and I think one of the biggest struggles was when I started grad school, just kind of coming from a very like I wasn't prepared. I think in the beginning, I didn't really have any, I had taken all the classes and stuff, but kind of the whole research enterprise was very intimidating. And it was, I always felt like I was like not like an innately smart person. Like it always took me way longer to understand something than a lot of my classmates would grasp like quickly. And I just, would have to go back and study it on my own and just like slowly understand. And that was probably the biggest struggle, I think. And, it never deterred me though, because I just always thought I can figure it out. And even if it's just a dogged brute force way. And yeah, I think that's probably the biggest struggle. And now as a professor, I think the struggle is just to, prioritize my research and work, and making sure, as like a junior faculty, you don't get spread too thin in many different directions. And also being a good mentor to my grad students, which no one really teaches you how to do.
We don't teach that, actually.
Yeah, so that, and I think, yeah, that's a struggle that I'm going through now. I think my grad students are fine. They haven't quit yet, but
we should interview them. No, just kidding.
But it's always a struggle to think like, am I doing, what am I doing and is it working? And you don't really know until you see results, and that can be a long time. So it's yeah, it can be hard to gauge.
Yeah, thanks. That's actually what I was wanting to get out of you. Just, I think for all of you out there, science is a journey, or whatever you do is a journey, and it doesn't come easy. And sometimes you think you're not ready, or you're not. We all have, what do they call that? Including myself. Imposter syndrome at different stages of our life or career. We keep it quiet and nobody knows, just ourselves, and we get neurotic about it. But the reality is that we're all going through that, and just recognize that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and just keep on going and on what you love to do, and it'll come out fine, I guess, right, Emily? More or less fine. Yeah.
And I think one of the things too, like maybe come from the background I came from, not really knowing about research, not kind of coming from like a fancy school or anything, or never having like a research experience as an undergrad, like a lot of top undergrads now have. And those are great. Like I wish I had that. But I think I just was really grateful for every opportunity I've had, because I never would have imagined I would have ended up here as a professor. And I think just having this, I'm like, wow, it's kind of amazing. Like I started like that and I ended up okay. And I guess Cin-Ty's like, yeah, she survived. But I think it's more, but it's like cultivating a sense of like gratefulness that, and luck too. A lot of the time, sometimes the project you're on, sometimes a lot of things don't work out, and sometimes you just get lucky. So I think I'm just grateful for all the mentors I've had, and all the people who like believed in me when I, didn't think I was going in the right direction. And I think for grad students, it's important to know that there's a lot of people holding you up, and your advisor, your institution, and they're trying to make, they're supporting you, even if it doesn't seem like it. And I think that, Cin-Ty, I'm really grateful for it. And Rice, like that, the whole environment at Rice was really amazing for that. And I think that really was what propelled me to be successful, like having that solid network and support system. And even if it's sort of secret, you don't know it at first, but it kind of.
Often advisors, I mean, as scientists, we're trained often to criticize and be negative. I mean, that's what scientists do, and often we forget that to say the good things all the time. And so that's just a reminder that we should all do that. And there's always good things in everything. So, okay, well, anything else you want to share with us, or does anyone else have any questions, prying questions for Emily? No?
Yeah, thank you for this. This was really fun, and I hope I hope it was useful.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable, very good.
I hope
So,
you keep doing these. We should get them like a regular.
well, I'd like to, and basically just, yeah, show that other side of science so that we all know that, I guess sometimes you see a scientist up there that you think that everything's perfect, but there's a story behind that. Or you see a paper, and the paper looks like it was written, their hypothesis started off, and they were right from the beginning, and it's just perfect. But we all know that that's not the way it goes. It's always messy. And so that's what I wanted to show, some of the messiness.
Yeah.
So
Thanks, Cin-Ty. This is great.
you did great, and really neat stuff that you're doing. And I guess on that note, I guess we'll say goodbye, and thanks everyone for
Thank you
joining.
all.
Stop recording here. There.